All right, the next body system we're learning about is the respiratory system, which exchanges gases. So the big learning intention for this section is that the respiratory system uses the lungs as the main organ, as well as some other accessory organs to exchange oxygen, bringing it in, and carbon dioxide, which leaves the body. The things you should be able to do after this section are describe the structure, including all the organs in the respiratory system, and describe the path that oxygen and carbon dioxide take throughout the body. Okay, a review of the role of the respiratory system. So most of us know that it's related to breathing. And the reason for that is because all of our cells need oxygen to survive, as well as food, in other words, sugar molecules. Oxygen is one of the two things that our cells need to give them energy. And that's because the way that cells get energy, if you think back to our last topic, is that it's the mitochondria that break down our food molecules into energy, and they need oxygen to do that. So we need to get oxygen by breathing it in from the environment and somehow transport that oxygen to every single cell in our body. And that's the role of the respiratory system combined with the circulatory system, as we'll learn at the end. On top of that, our cells produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. This whole process of the mitochondria breaking down food to make energy is called cellular respiration. And it's essentially a chemical reaction that uses oxygen and food to make energy, but it produces carbon dioxide and water as wastes. So we need to get rid of that carbon dioxide by breathing it out. So overall, we say that the respiratory system exchanges gases by bringing in the oxygen and bringing out the carbon dioxide. All right, let's learn the structure of the respiratory system. So which organs make up the system and how are they connected together and what do they look like? So initially, we have the nose and mouth. Obviously, that's where air enters our body, and that's the first step in the process. So this is where air enters and leaves the body. Then the air travels to the back of our throat, and to avoid going into the digestive system, which we want to avoid, obviously, we have this small organ called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is basically like a little trapdoor. And when we're breathing, most of the time, it is open on the windpipe side so that air can pass through from our nose and mouth and down into our lungs. But when we swallow, we want food to go not into our lungs because that's obviously dangerous. We want the food to go into the digestive system. So when we swallow, the epiglottis swings shut like a tiny trapdoor. It swings across and then it only lets the food travel into the digestive system, which we've already learnt about. So the epiglottis controls the flow of air. And ensures it only goes into the lungs. Once the air passes the epiglottis, now we're in the respiratory system. And the windpipe is the next part, the next organ that the air travels through. So you can see it's covered in these loops of cartilage there to hold the windpipe into a cylinder shape. And the scientific name for the windpipe is the trachea, or trachea, which essentially carries air to the lungs and out. All right, since we have two lungs, the trachea breaks into two smaller windpipes, which are called bronchi. And so that's these two small windpipes here. Bronchi is plural, and one of them, if you're talking about just one, is called a bronchus. And again, they carry the air in and out of the lungs into each separate lung. Now the air splits into these even smaller windpipes, which are called bronchioles. So you can see that the windpipes branch off into smaller and smaller branches, almost looking like a tree if you look at the cross-section of your lungs. And the whole organ, obviously, is the lung, which is where the gas exchange occurs. So the lungs is the site of gas exchange overall. The bronchioles, well, they carry the air to these final tiny organs, which we'll look at, that are called alveoli. So the job of the bronchioles is to carry air to and from the alveoli. And then we finally reach the end of the line, which are these dead-end tiny organs called the alveoli. And that's actually where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. All right, there's one final organ that actually causes us to breathe, and that's called the diaphragm, which is just a muscle right down here underneath your lungs. And when we want to breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and pulls down, and that causes our lungs to expand and bring in air from the environment. And then when the diaphragm relaxes, it causes the lungs to be forced upwards and they force air out. So they cause us to be able to breathe. They cause and control our breathing. So let's look at the alveoli in a bit more detail. If we zoom in on the end of one of these bronchioles, so here bronchiole branching off, then you can see we get to these little broccoli-shaped structures, and they're the alveoli at the end. They look like broccoli because that has the maximum surface area, so we can get lots of contact between the blood vessels, which are called capillaries, and the actual alveoli, which are basically just hollow sacs full of air. So here are the small bronchioles at the end of the line. And you can see that each alveolus is surrounded by lots of blood vessels, and they're called capillaries. And the whole reason for that is because we need to get the air from the alveoli into the blood. And so the capillaries wrap around them really tightly. And the red capillaries are carrying the freshly oxygenated blood. And then the dark blue capillaries are carrying deoxygenated blood, which needs to have fresh oxygen added to it. And let's look at how that happens. So it's a relatively simple process when we're down at the alveoli to see how we get our oxygen and carbon dioxide. So here is one of the alveoli, and here's a capillary flowing alongside it, carrying our red blood cells. And you can see here the air can travel in and out as we breathe in and out, filling up and emptying out as we breathe in and out. So that's the first step. The oxygenated air moves into the alveolus when we take a big breath in. Then the old blood that's deoxygenated, well, it's full of carbon dioxide. So it releases its CO2 into the air inside the alveolus. And at the same time, the fresh oxygen from the air is moving into our blood, into the red blood cells, so they're ready to transport the oxygen off to the rest of the body. And then all of that CO2 moves out of the alveolus and all the way out through our mouth or nose into the environment. And the reason we use these blue and red colors when we're looking at blood cells is because oxygenated blood actually has a really bright, fresh color. And when it's deoxygenated, it looks like this dark, blacky purple. So we use blue to represent that. And if you look at your arms or hands, you can see that the veins are blue colored because they're deoxygenated. And if you could see an artery, they're carrying the oxygenated blood, so they're much deeper red. But they're not on the surface of your skin, luckily, so you can't see them as easily. The final point to look at is remembering that all our body systems work together. They're not isolated, and one system can't work without the control of other systems and without the assistance. So firstly, the nervous system and the endocrine system, they're controlling all our other body systems. And when we look at the respiratory system, it's obviously very closely tied to the circulatory system here. Because once that oxygen has been transferred into the bloodstream, well then it's the job of the circulatory system to send it all around the body. So it goes through our arms, into the brain, through all of our limbs and organs, and that's how the oxygen gets transported to every cell in our entire body. And it's the same in reverse with carbon dioxide. The CO2 is produced in all of our cells, and it needs to be transported by the circulatory system back into the lungs, ready for us to be able to breathe it out as a waste. So every body system requires other systems to work together.